Hey there! In this lecture we're going to learn about numbers, how many types of numbers there are, how we can represent them, and how we can store them in variables. And we are also going to see about Booleans. We've studied them, like we know what Booleans are. Booleans are values of true and false. We're going to learn more about them. And so as you can see about numbers. We have seen different types of numbers, but now we're going to classify them using particular names. Okay, so the first thing we need to consider over here is that, as you can remember, we have seen that we can store numbers in variables, but we do not have discussed the data types in more detail. So let's look at them. So the first data type you should consider over here is in the numbers is the integer. So the good thing about Python is that you do not need explicit data typing. Like in other languages, you need to specify the type of the variable before you actually assign values to it. For example, I would have to write like this, and the semicolon. This shows that this is the syntax of C language. Okay, so in this particular example, you see that we need to specify beforehand the type of value we're going to store in a variable. Okay. So since this is not Python, this is an invalid syntax. That's why we're not able to run it. So the thing about Python, the beauty and the flexibility Python provides us is that we do not need explicit data typing before to initialize our variables. It automatically does that. For example, if I write a is equals to 34, it stores an integer value in a, and which is 34. And if I store the same value like 3.4, which is a float value or a floating point, it would store that value without explicitly instructing it that we are going to store this value. Okay, so as you can see, understand by now that there are two types of numbers in the number system. There are integers which are without any points, and there are floating points which have the point in them. Okay, so we also call them as float and floating point, and here should be int. Okay, let's have a look at them. Okay, so we also know, we have seen that we do not need explicit typecasting, explicitly instructing what type of value we're going to store in the variable. Python actually allows that. Okay, so let's look at another function, another built-in Python function that enables us to find out the data type of a particular variable. So we have initialized b with 9.5 and a with 9. So a is an integer type and b is a floating type variable. Let's say we want to find out more, like let's say, how do we know for sure that this is a floating point and this is a number? So for this we're going to use a special function in Python called the type. Okay, so what does this function do? It tells us about the type of the variable which we have used. So the type of a should be integer, and so it gives us int, and the type of b should be float. Okay, so it's pretty obvious, it's pretty clear now that this function enables us to find out the type of variable. Now the next question is how we can change the data type of one variable from floating point to integer or integer to floating point. It is usually beneficial, especially when you do not need, if you're working on a problem and you do not need answer in floating points, you only need answer in integers. So if you're getting an answer due to some in division that it is not in integer, you need to use some method which will enable us to produce an integer from a floating point. So that is what we call the concept of typecasting. So we are going to change the type of a variable from one particular type to another. So let's look at an example. Let's see, I'm going to divide 5 by 2, and the answer I get over here is 2.5. I'm not interested in the 0.5, I'm only interested in the 2 value. So what I need to do is I'm going to use the built-in function of Python, which is actually there are two functions. If you want to convert floating point to integer, we're going to use the int, and if you want to change the integer into floating point, we will use the float. These are both built-in functions in Python, and we're going to see how we can do that. So you remember the a over here we've initialized. So let's change a into a floating point. So if you want to change 9 into a floating point, what would happen is that we're going to add another point, like it would become 9.0. So let's change the value of int a into a floating point. So since I want to convert the integer into a floating point, I will use the float function, and I'm going to pass the a value in it, and I'm going to shift plus enter, and you get the value of 9.0. Now let's take another example of the divide variable and convert the divide into integer. So what would happen here is that we would ultimately get 2. So now we have converted 2.5 into 2. We have truncated or dropped the floating point value, and in float it actually adds the floating point. So let's look at the other type of data type, which is the Boolean data type, and we can use the Boolean in different ways. Like we have seen that these are values of true and false only. So you can say like true and false, and that would represent the data type of a Boolean. And again, you do not need to explicitly mention that you are going to initialize a variable with a Boolean value. You just need to assign a variable to a Boolean value. For example, r is equals to true, s is equals to false. So like I said, and if you want to check the type of both these values, r so this is the Boolean value. So this has actually you can say shows the class, and which is the class, but we'll not go into the depth of it. The only thing, it is basically a data type, and class is also a data type, and Boolean would be the class belonging to the variable. So if you do not understand the word class over here, do not worry, just forget about it. You can just call it a data type. It's the same thing as the Boolean variable. So zeros and ones are also considered to be Boolean values. At least you can use it like them, even though they are actually integers, but they can be used like Boolean values. But the true Boolean values are only trues and false.